Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the third episode of Candid Reviews. So in this episode, I am going to be doing a review on a book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Now, this book was actually really difficult for me to do a review on because it is a somewhat philosophical book, and it's a very philosophical book. And I think for that reason, every person who reads it will probably get something different from it. And so this review is solely my interpretation of the book and what I've taken from it. And it was actually fairly difficult to put into words what I've learned from it. So the book was written about 2,000 years ago by a Chinese war strategist and philosopher. And I guess, as the title would suggest, it is somewhat easy to assume that this book is just about war. And I think for that reason it can be somewhat unappealing as a result. But aside from the physical component of war, there is also a psychological and philosophical part that is actually pretty applicable to many everyday life situations. Okay, so the book itself is small. I have it here. So it's pretty thin. It contains 13 chapters, and they cover things like war, obviously, strategy, and also leadership. Now, over the centuries, this book has actually been very influential to military strategists, people in business, and also athletes. This book was not written with specific steps on how to apply the principles, and I think that's what makes it so challenging. And so it kind of leaves it open, not only open to interpretation, but it also leaves the flexibility for the reader to reflect on their own current situation and then apply the principles in a specific and more personal way, which I actually think is really good. One of the essential ways of Sun Tzu's thinking was to overcome others' armies without fighting. And according to him, this is one of the best skills to actually attain. Now, I picked up this book in my very early 20s for the first time, and as a martial artist, I was very interested in learning about the strategies of how to read your opponent and correctly estimate the circumstances that you're in to increase the likelihood of victory in competitions. That was my reason for it. But I later then realized that this knowledge could actually be applied to my relationships and my everyday interactions with people. So what have I actually learned from this book? So the first thing that I learned is to attack your opponent's intentions and not your opponent. So according to Sun Tzu, the very essence of the art of war is not to attack your opponent, but rather to attack their intentions in a form of emotional aikido. Now, I'm not a fan of war, but like with everything in life, you can't have peace without war. And they are, unfortunately, opposite sides of the same coin. So after reading this book, I replaced war with conflict, as I found that that was much more relatable to my life. And I guess it became somewhat of a conflict resolution strategy for me. So the principle then became to use the strategy of avoiding direct confrontation and reading your opponent to diffuse the conflict in a situation. Now, as I said before, this book doesn't come with a step-by-step guide on how to actually apply any of this, but my conflict resolution strategy looks something like this. Okay, so first I put my emotions on the back burner and try to assess the situation from an objective perspective, or at least as objective as I possibly can in the given moment. I ask myself, what is this person saying and what do they really mean? Because they can be two very different things. And also, what is their body language telling me? What are the non-verbal cues they're giving me? I try to avoid using abrasive language and keep a calm tone of voice because I don't want to upset the person even more, because that is not my goal. I ask questions rather than making statements. This helps the other person to feel like I'm not attacking them in any way and I am actually trying to come to some kind of agreement with them. So all of this helps to identify the other person's true intentions, also their emotional state, and it kind of tells me what I need to do to influence them into a positive state that is mutually beneficial for the both of us. Now, this became especially important once I got into the working world with, different people, different personalities who had different goals. And I was often faced with situations where conflict was present at some level. It was just inevitable. But I'm not saying all conflict is bad, or that it's not always necessary. And I think it is possible for an agreement to actually be reached between people without resorting to conflict. And it probably helps that I am a naturally conflict avoidant person, believe it or not. And I have found that learning to read a person and a situation, and I guess using subtle persuasive techniques to diffuse a situation has, fortunately for me, meant that I have actually been able to avoid a lot of interpersonal conflict throughout my life, which I am incredibly grateful for. So the second point that I've taken from this book is to be like water. Now, for anyone who is a martial arts fan, this will sound oddly familiar. So the central metaphor of Sun Tzu's work is to behave like water. Now, according to him, water is both powerful and empty of form, which makes it impossible to attack and impossible to resist. This metaphor has been echoed by many other strategists. Now, one of my favourite martial artists, Bruce Lee, said the following when talking about his famous fighting style. So I'm going to quote Bruce Lee, and it's a pretty repetitive quote, so I apologize for the repetition. So he says, "You must be shapeless and formless like water. When you pour water into a cup, it becomes a cup. When you pour water into a bottle, it becomes a bottle. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Water can drip and it can crash, so become like water." So I guess how this applies to real life is to remain flexible and adaptable in both your situations, your plans, and the execution of those plans. It is especially important when dealing with people because, as we know, change is the only constant in life and people can be very unpredictable. Now, for some, it can be very easy to find one plan and not want to deviate from it. But this inflexibility can actually become problematic if things don't work out how you foresee them. So if you stay flexible and open to change, this will allow you to adapt as and when needed, and therefore become powerful. Flexibility is in essence power, because what bends has a much higher breaking point if it actually breaks at all. Okay, so in conclusion, there are many different translations of this book, and I would suggest choosing something that actually hasn't been directly translated from Chinese because it can be more like a poem, and I think that makes it a lot more difficult to read. Now, this is one of those books that you probably want to read more than once, and from my experience, every time I've read it, I have got something different out of it, or found a more deeper meaning to what I was reading. It's one of my, favorite books for that reason. But as I mentioned before, working in the industry that I work in, I often see communication styles that are aggressive and abrasive, and even though they might get a result of some kind, it certainly isn't favourable when you're trying to build working relationships with people, and those are very important, not only in the workplace, but just in general. Now, I don't think Sun Tzu's strategy is passive by any means. It is, in my opinion, more purposeful and result-seeking, and something that I have found has really worked for me in my life so far. So, as I said before as well, this is just my interpretation of the book, and if you have found something completely different, I would be really, really interested to know what you've gotten out of it. So let me know in the comments if you've found something better, cooler, different, whatever. I'd love to know. So anyway, thanks for watching and see you next time.